We stand a better chance under that guise, because all the serious people like Martin Luther King and Kennedy and Gandhi got shot.
Hello, welcome to episode 275 of Something About the Beatles podcast. And as we are upon the 60th anniversary of the Beatles arriving in America, doing the Ed Sullivan Show, and all that entailed, we will be doing some shows on that event. Not right now, not today's show, of course, but you'll be having that to look forward to soon. I instead am pivoting to something a lot more heavy and serious that took place in that same city, 1980, of course, the murder of John Lennon. Now, this show exists both to entertain and to educate, and honestly, the topic today is not one that most people would find particularly entertaining, but hopefully you will find it educational. In that, as I've alluded to elsewhere, I never thought that the official narrative of what happened that night added up. I always thought there were things about it that didn't make sense, and this was not with me delving that deeply into it, although I have delved deeper into other highly public murders, as it were. But I hadn't really, and I knew there was books that had been written about it, and a lot of chatter, a lot of conspiratorial chatter, which I tend to shy away from because it's like once you go down that rabbit hole, nothing is real. Everything is fake. Everything is conspiracy. Everything is put up, and no official explanation of anything is valid. I don't want to live in that world. Nonetheless, I guess we already do in a lot of respects. And some speculation involving the person who took John's life. And I will tell you right now from the onset, anybody who is offended by hearing the name Mark David Chapman, or who, quite understandably, doesn't want to hear a description of the physical wounds, this show is probably not for you, because they're essential to the conversation. They have to be talked about to get to the point of the subject of today's show. So that said, if you are listening to this and you're not familiar with something called MK Ultra, I would advise you to look it up, because it was a real thing. It was a CIA mind control program that ended in the 70s when it was uncovered. However, it had been in the works for many years before that. It was a thing. And there are people connected to it that attest to what its goals were. Among them, getting a subject to do, under their influence, things they wouldn't ordinarily do, including murder. Again, I'm not trying to get all conspiratorial. The thesis being presented here is not about getting Mark David Chapman off the hook. He was certainly involved. To what degree is far less certain. And the narrative given has actually changed through the years. There's been a number of tellings and motivations given, among them being a thirst for fame. All of this is discussed in the book written by my guest, David Whelan, Mind Games, The Assassination of John Lennon. And as it happens in this conversation, we really only got to a third to half of what I wanted to talk about. So we may do a follow-up show later. But I would want you to keep your mind open if you're listening to this show in its entirety and listen to what he uncovered. You may want to do your own research if you think there's a there, but it's a highly charged emotional subject. And frequently, starting with when the word was announced of his book back almost a year ago in April 2023, plenty of people not familiar with his work or the book, because it hadn't been published yet, were very quick on the trigger online to slam it down and accuse him of all kinds of things, essentially boiling down to wanting to make a fast buck by peddling nonsense. The fact that I have him on the show gives you an idea of how I hold him in esteem and his work. And if I thought it was nonsense, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I would advise you to look around rather than simply take David's word for what he presents in his book. You can absolutely, and I hope you do, check out his research and his findings. To his credit, he doesn't present a theory on what happened. I mean, he offers potential scenarios, but he doesn't come down and, yes, this is the way it happened, folks, which is to his credit, because we don't know. There's too many things we do not know. There are things we can know if enough attention gets focused and enough push gets made to reopen the case, which would be nice. But there have been plenty of anomalies that just don't add up, things about this case that we were told that don't make sense or lack of detail, as he says. So that's what we're going to discuss today. You can listen, check out his book if you'd like, but what I don't want to hear from, and there's going to be plenty of people just when I post the show, they're going to be reacting viscerally to it without having an informed opinion. Criticism is fine if you check out his work, check out the book, listen to this conversation. Critique away. But without doing any of that, your opinion is not really worth anything, so don't waste our time. But if you are on board for checking this out, do see what you think. I don't know what I think other than I respect and appreciate the work he's put into this. And clearly something's not right, and I come to no conclusions other than it really needs a reinvestigation. So, see what you think.
Do you know what happened? Have any idea what happened?
He was leaving his apartment. He was leaving a limousine in front of him, arriving at home, and he was shot from behind in the vestibule of his apartment.
No idea why?
Not at this
no
time.
altercation?
You have an assailant in custody.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Can you describe him?
Just at this time that he's a male white, young boy.
There was a talk of a second suspect. Is there anything to that?
I don't know.
You said a young boy. Well, how young?
You're badgering me. I don't
I'm
really know.
I'm sorry. We're just very
I don't know. A
interested.
young male around 20. I saw him for a couple of seconds.
Your PIO officer is saying that he is dead. Is that
I
the
didn't
fact?
say that. No, I didn't.
No,
I didn't say that.
When I was in single digits, my older brother put a copy of Rush to Judgment into my hands.
Right.
And that kind of opened my mind at a young age to look beyond the surface explanations of things. And I found in reading your book an awful lot of things that called back to other things and other assassinations.
That's good. I'm glad you say that. Yeah, I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, and also you'd called out pretty early on the Richard Popkin book, The Second Oswald.
Yeah, it's all of that was intentional, Robert. So I'm glad you picked up on that, because I think there are echoes,
Absolutely.
which I wasn't expecting at all. You know, we need to talk about this. I came into this totally blind with no expectations. It's a cliche, but I literally just fell down a very deep rabbit hole that I didn't even think was there
Right.
in the first place. And the deeper I got, the more I felt obliged to go further. And then shocking, I was shocked, to be honest with you, and deeply disturbed, many sleepless nights. And I just thought, because I knew what was coming, you know, I knew once I got the information that it all wasn't as it was supposed to be, I knew once I broke this eventually, if I did decide to break it, I would get enormous backlash. And I did get an enormous backlash. The vitriol in April was off the charts.
Right.
Not surprised, you know, it's a very emotive subject.
Yeah, as you write in the book, you're talking about Brad Trent. I understand his reluctance to put aside the cognitive dissonance which stops many people accepting the facts simply because they were taught or believed differently. It is a difficult emotion to challenge. The Lennon assassination is a highly emotive issue, and many people have completely bought into the official narrative. It has been spoon-fed to them for 43 years. Emotions often triumph over logic.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's completely it. And I completely understand, because in my due diligence for this show, and even before I'd gotten the copy of your book, I wanted to see what you were saying, what other people were saying. This is a pretty typical thing I found online, which I'm sure you expected. Somebody commenting on an article about it. Chapman walked up to John Lennon and shot him point blank. Chapman's wife knew what he was going to do. He showed her the gun. She said she didn't believe he was going to do it, so she didn't call the police. Yoko saw it happen. Yoko was standing next to her husband. Wow. What some people won't do to make a buck. So
That's one of the kinder ones.
right, you can refute point by point all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But before we start getting into the nitty-gritty of this, I wanted to discuss, for the sake of the listeners, your background. You are, it's been said, you're a writer and a documentary filmmaker in Britain. and what your background was and how you got started on this journey.
Okay. It's not a typical background for this kind of journey. I've got no legal background. I've got no trained journalism background. I was brought up by a single Irish mother in London. So that was difficult. Not an ideal childhood, to be honest. So I kind of drifted through that. My only solace through childhood was music and television and film once I could get into the cinema.
Mm-hmm. Were you an only child?
Yeah, only child. It was a lonely, difficult childhood. But I had friends, I don't want to make out of some kind of Dickens character. But I got a lot of solace out of entertainment, out of music, out of TV. And that was my escape. I used that to escape, really, from a rather, I think, dull childhood initially until I found my voice and found friends and evolved. But the biggest stroke of luck for me, my education wasn't great. I found school incredibly boring. I was put in a kind of high class. They knew I could do it, but I was just too distracted to really focus on my education. And coming from the background that I came from, the word university, I don't think no one even mentioned it or spoke about college, or it just, I was expected to go and do manual work the second I could pick up a shovel. That's a bit of a cliche, coming from an Irish background, but pretty much all my family were builders and dug the roads. So that was kind of the future that was laid out for me. The big bit of luck for me, and it was just a life-changing bit of luck, was there was a government scheme by the Conservative government in the 80s, a dreadful government, but they did one good thing. It was called a youth training scheme, and it allowed young people like me who left school and weren't going to college or university to go into a workplace and study and work there for a year for very low pay. And I just lucked my way into a massive TV station in London called Thames Television, which was a kind of UK broadcaster, the biggest one at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like walking into Hollywood. There were studios in London. There was famous people just walking around all the time. There were people in there who opened my eyes up to everything, really. I just had people who were just fascinating, interesting people to work with. And I was very lucky. After a year, they kept me on. And I sort of started out in research, in film research initially. I worked as an assistant film editor. I then became a news researcher. I went to sort of evolve into the news area of the company, which they allowed you to move around, which is great. So you could do a bit of sport, a bit of news, a bit of this. It was wonderful. And there was documentaries being made.
I'm glad you brought up this background because I want people to know about this, because I've seen it in your LinkedIn profile that you are a researcher. Which informs the work of this book.
Yeah, I kind of lost that skill, to be honest. I kind of moved into sport, which was wonderful, and a lot of travel. And if you love sport like I do, it was a very easy gig for me, but creatively not very fulfilling. But what was great at Thames News when I was working there is I saw how news works, and I saw how the editor would send a journalist off to go and cover a story. And before they left the building, they knew what that story was going to be. It was kind of osmosis, the angle was already, it didn't need to be said. They didn't need a crib sheet. It was kind of like, this is the story. And they knew how to come back and cover that story the way they expected it to be covered from an editorial point of view. So investigative journalism didn't exist. And I don't think it does exist in mainstream news. These guys are very much automatons. They're told to go out and cover the story the way it's expected to be covered. So I saw that from a very early age. So that was interesting. And I suppose the next big moment for me was Oliver Stone's JFK film, which would have been, 91?
Yes.
So I'd been working in TV. I started at 17. So by 91, I was kind of quite a hardened guy. I'd been in there. I had a head start from all the university kids, really. I kind of, I had experience, which is what really counts in television. But by 91, I'd been in it for 8 years. I was kind of quite comfortable. I was beginning to move into sport. And I saw Oliver Stone's film, and because of my Irish background, JFK is a big figure in Irish culture. I remember a lot of relatives' homes in Ireland. I used to be shipped off to Ireland every holiday because my mother had to work. She couldn't look after me. So I kind of get put on a plane and picked up the other end, and I'd spend summers and Easters and stuff in Ireland. And I'd see this picture of JFK on the wall in all my relatives' homes. And I remember it's one of my earliest memories thinking, who is that handsome dude next to Jesus and the Pope? Which again was, very regular pictures to be found. So I always kind of knew about him, and I knew how important he was to Irish culture and Irish history. Mm-hmm. And when I saw that film, I hate saying it, but it was a red pill moment. I came out and I just thought, wow, I've really got this all wrong. There's stuff that goes on that I don't know about. Because I worked in mainstream news, I consumed mainstream news. I thought the world was as straight as a die, and the whole thing just didn't make any sense. And then when you start to look into the JFK assassination, as you mentioned earlier with Mark Lane's book For You start to get into these works And it goes deeper and deeper, and you just think, well, there's just no question about it. And of course, the House Committee on Assassinations, as you know, in 1978 said it was probably an assassination, probably a conspiracy, and there were probably 2 shooters. So even the official American government have kind of, the last word they said on it was probably a conspiracy. And of course, anyone who studies it can find that out pretty quickly. So that was always there, just this interest. But I never went too deep into Martin Luther King. I never went too deep into RFK. I just I found JFK interesting, but I parked it. It wasn't an obsession. I didn't read hundreds of books. I just read 3 or 4 books and then moved on to something else. I've got one of these minds where I get really into a subject. I consume it until I'm satisfied that I understand that subject, and then I move on to the next subject. I can't stay on one thing forever. I've got one of these agile minds that needs to keep moving around. And then with the Lennon thing, I didn't know I'll admit it now. I don't think I even knew who John Lennon was in 1980. I was 14. He'd been inactive for 5 years. I started getting into music, mid-70s, after his last album, but I was getting into pop chart hits. I wasn't getting into Mind Games or anything like that. And then when Starting Over came out, I'd probably dismissed as an old has-been rocker. There was this horrible, in the 80s, you might remember it in America, I don't know if it was a thing in America, in the UK in the 80s, there was this kind of 50s revival.
Oh, yes.
And you'd get these 50s bands next to these new wave music. And I used to hate it. It's like, what? Mum and dad music, why have you come back? Go back to the 50s where you belong. I want to see Blondie or The Jam or XTC. I don't want to see Shawaddy Waddy, and I don't want to see a guy with a quiff. And of course, Grease didn't help that. Grease kind of helped that revival, of course. So when Lennon came out with Starting Over, I probably dismissed it as a 50s pastiche song, which is kind of what it is. I mean, of course, now I appreciate it. I appreciate what he was trying to do. So by 1980, when he died, I remember I was going to school. I remember I got on the bus, and I remember lots of newspapers opened up with Lennon shot dead. I remember the headlines were big and stark, and I remember thinking, I actually do remember thinking, who's John Lennon? Who's this guy that's so important that the newspapers are all going crazy about him? And then, of course, Imagine came out, and Woman, and it all got very maudlin. And I found out very quickly, obviously, on the news, what a big deal he was and who they were. And obviously, as you get older, as anyone who's interested in music, you're going to get into the Beatles. You're going to, oh, wow, this White Album's fun. And you just start diving in. And, for me, the Beatles really only started, even now, my interest really comes kind of Help, Rubber Soul. I'm not that interested in the early stuff, to be honest. It's great. I like it, but I like the Beatles when they started taking drugs, to be honest. That's when I found them most interesting. And
did you pick up, at the time this was happening and you didn't know who John Lennon was,
yeah.
Did you pick up on reactions of adults and other people?
Yeah.
Because it's often been compared with your book in a whole different direction, but with the death of JFK, for people who weren't around in 1963, this was our JFK moment, and just people world around were deeply grieving.
Yeah, it was a big deal. Yeah, it was. There was a lot of wailing and tears on the news. Not in my family. I come from a kind of no-nonsense family that didn't really get into it. They didn't do maudlin because they were just too busy paying the bills, and kind of they didn't have time for culture. They didn't have time for reflection. I think that was kind of more of a middle-class thing. Obviously, Pitt in Liverpool, he was a son of Liverpool. I think it was felt quite deeply up there. But I did learn to appreciate, and I love the Beatles now, of course. How can you love music and not love the Beatles and love what Lennon did? I think solo is patchy, to be fair.
Sure.
But if you said to me in 1980, what would it be? In 40 years' time, you're going to start investigating this guy's murder and you're going to uncover a lot of stuff that nobody knows, I'd have called you crazy. I'd have just got no chance, no way. I just didn't have the interest. I didn't have the passion. And in a way, I think that's kind of my strength here, that I'm not bringing emotion to the table and I'm not bringing any agenda to the table. I kind of went in totally clean. I had no agenda. I had no Lennon obsession. And I've made a real important decision early on not to listen to Beatles music or Lennon music. And I still don't really listen to it a lot now because I didn't want the emotion of the music to tap into what I was doing. So I kind of parked that and I just wanted to look at it. Once I started to realize there were massive anomalies, I wanted to look at it as just an exercise in logic, pretty much. If I really boil it down and kind of, okay, stuff's not adding up here, but stuff should add up. So why don't I just logically try and figure this puzzle out? And that's kind of where the book came from, to kind of try and get some kind of clarity.
What put you on that trail to begin with?
It was lockdown. It was 2020. It was the spring of 2020. I've said this a few times. The first few weeks in lockdown, I kind of enjoyed it. I like the not feeling guilty about working bit, which is, I've always had this kind of thing where you should always be working or at least thinking about working. So to not work, and for the rest of the world not to work, and for everyone just to park up and do nothing for a few weeks, I just thought, wow, that's just great. I can read some books and listen to music without feeling guilty. Watch some films, just literally do nothing. Wow, I like the idea of that. And I was out walking the dog, listening to a podcast. It's another story, we won't go into it now, but it's a kind of an ancient place I was doing this. It's a kind of, goes back to kind of Stonehenge times, this location I was walking in. It's quite a spiritual place called Seven Springs. But I was walking around this field, not really thinking about much, listening to a podcast called Black Ops Radio, okay, which is a kind of JFK podcast. I don't always listen to this podcast, strangely, even though I'm into the JFK case. I don't know why I started listening to Black Ops Radio again, but I did. I think it might be because Oliver Stone and Jim DiEugenio, who feature heavily in Black Ops Radio, I think they did a documentary, didn't they, last year or the year before?
JFK Revisited?
That's the one, yeah. So I think that's what kind of got me interested in it again. I watched that and I thought that was very impressive. So I was listening to this podcast, listening to Jim DiEugenio on this podcast, probably talking about that TV series. And near the end of the podcast, Jim always does letters where people write in and say, you know, whatever they want to say. And normally at this point, I'd turn off because I've got all the information I need. I'm not really into feedback. But for some reason, I kept on listening. And I often wonder if I turned off that podcast that day, whether my whole life will be different now. But I kept listening. And someone wrote a letter in and just said to Jim, what do you know about the doorman at the Dakota when John Lennon was assassinated, being a CIA Cuban assassin? And I just thought, wow, there's a lot of interesting stuff in that question. I had no idea about doorman and, you know, assassin and all that. I thought, well, that's interesting. That's an interesting theory. I didn't stop dead in my tracks, but I remember making a mental note, I need to look into that. That sounds interesting. Jim didn't know anything about it. He said, no, I don't know anything about that. So, okay. And I got home. So what had this been? March, April 2020?
Mm-hmm.
Started to look into this doorman. And there is, as you know, I'm sure you know, there's the Dorman did it kind of internet community.
Mm-hmm.
And there's reasons for that. They've been kind of led into believing that by a journalist and some articles. So initially I bought that. I thought, oh, let's look into this. You know, is this guy who these people say he is? And I started to find out that he wasn't. So I said, okay, that's a bit of a red herring. And then the one thing that really stood out for me, Robert, initially, straight away was, where's the detail? Where was he shot? In the driveway? Was he shot in the vestibule? Was he shot in the concierge's office? Was he shot in the driveway? Was he shot on the sidewalk? There's a BBC documentary where you see him getting shot on the sidewalk. Where? You know, was he shot getting out of the limo? Where on his body was he shot? Was he shot in his back, his front, his side, his shoulders? Where? And I just realized there was no detail. And when there was detail, it was always conflicting.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, this is really odd. We should know. And it had echoes of JFK. I started to get echoes of JFK where there's a lot of talk about, was he shot in his throat? Was he shot on his back, behind his neck? Was he shot in the front? Was he shot in the back? It was all very JFK-esque.
Mm-hmm.
The confusion. And that's probably where I thought, okay, I just need to keep looking. I need to keep digging. And that's where the journey started.
For myself, I remember the event vividly, and it seemed like there was no mystery to it. There's the guy, there's the gun. He says he did it. He said why he did it. It was all, to use the police term, buttoned up right away. And as I got older, I never researched it deeply. I didn't look into it like I'd looked at other assassinations, but there was enough there that made me uncomfortable. And I've said this on the show that I started to suspect that it didn't happen the way we were told it did because it didn't make sense to me. And this is as somebody who has been to the Dakota and saw the physical layout of it. And when you're at a place that you've read about or heard about, like I've been to Dealey Plaza, suddenly the reality of it and how small it all is, it's like, it's not the way you envision it. You go there, it's like, wow, this is really compacted. So there's the guardhouse at the Dakota where Jose Padermo was, and supposedly Chapman came in off the sidewalk and shot Lennon as he was walking away from him. It's a very small area, and yet I'm reading that he collapsed inside, and I'm thinking if the shooting took place the way we were told, 4 bullets in the back, and I also remember hearing very early on these were exploding bullets. These were the hollow point ones that aren't supposed to leave your body, and yet I'm seeing low bullet holes in the glass at the vestibule entrance there. And so it didn't make sense to me, and the thought occurred to me, well, they had the apparent shooter in hand. They didn't investigate any further, did they? So I was sort of ripe to be curious about finding out more when I became aware of your book. And I was aware of the other 2 books that came out, Who Killed John Lennon and Let Me Take You Down. I hadn't actually read them because honestly, I think I was afraid of what I would see. When you're in the JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King universe, you're already sort of aware of a lot of things that are almost too big to wrap your mind around. And as soon as I started reading about Chapman in the context of Manchurian Candidate, I sort of backed off because it's like, unless somebody really gets into the forensics of this because I'm slow and I need to be walked through this, I don't think I can wrap my head around it. So when your book came along, that was like, okay, here's somebody now at a point in time where I think we're a bit more ready for this sort of thing. And then there was the Apple TV series, Murder Without a Trial. Is that what it's called? With Kiefer Sutherland. So it just seemed like events are sort of converging to where maybe it is time to look into this stuff a little deeper. So I was so gratified to see your book, and then once I read it, that you've done such an amazing job with it.
Thank you.
So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I mean, yeah, it's, again, the feedback's been wonderful and unexpected, Robert. When you write a book, you hope it's going to be well received, but you don't know. You just put it out there and see what happens. And it's interesting. Most people, the phrase that keeps coming back is mind blown. My mind has been blown. And another interesting thing people keep saying is, I kind of always knew, like you just said now, I kind of always knew there was something not quite right about that. You know, I didn't know what it was, but just something was off.
Right.
I've heard that a lot. I've heard that a hell of a lot. But as I say in my book, as you know, I cover a couple of chapters on the media and the figures in the media who've sold this story very specifically and very deliberately. It has been a very well sold, consistently sold murder. But what those characters do not do ever, if you look at their work and study their work, and I can name who they are. There was a journalist called Jim Gaines, who's a very prominent journalist. I think he was the editor of People magazine. That's a heck of a guy. And the other guy was a journalist called Jack Jones, journalist/writer called Jack Jones. And those 2 people have had a clear run to tell the story for 43 years. And what they don't do, though, when you study their work, is they never go into detail. They never talk about specifics about where John was shot and where Chapman was standing and where the bullets were and what happened immediately after John was shot. All that's completely missing. And they never go into the medical. They just skim over the medical, and they'd say John went to hospital and they couldn't save him. End of story. But as you know, with JFK, once you start investigating the medical, you're starting to get to the truth of what really happened, or partly to the truth of what really happened. And the medical, with regards to John, was where I decided to start my journey.
And that's a great place to start it because, to borrow a phrase, that's the best evidence. And it is very striking what the emergency room doctors saw versus what we were told after the fact, what became the narrative. So if we want to start at that point, it should be said, there may be listeners that have seen or lived through a lot of the news coverage that was put into the media at the time of the event. And as you go through the book, as your research shows, a lot of people putting out particular stories were flat out lying. Whether it was doctors, the one who claimed he massaged John's heart, people who claimed they carried his body out to the police car, Elliot Mintz saying there was blood on the sidewalk. There's any number of things that got hardened into fact because seemingly credible people said them that do not stand up to analysis as you detail in the book.
Yeah. I think the biggest problem was a doctor called Dr. Lin. who's the guy everyone famously probably sees coming out on the steps with a moustache, pristine white coat, telling the press that in a very dramatic pause, lots of pauses, tells them that John has died with 7 wounds. And John did have 7 wounds, for sure. I think that's pretty much a certainty now. But the problem is Dr. Lin, ever since that moment, enjoyed his time in the limelight, enjoyed the cameras, and made sure that he got on every single documentary or magazine interview specifying that he was the doctor who tried to save John Lennon's life. He was the surgeon that was there pumping John Lennon's heart. And what Dr. Lin didn't do, what Stephen Lin didn't do, is what Jim Gaines and Jack Jones didn't do. He didn't go into detail because he couldn't go into detail because he wasn't that close. He was in the room, but he wasn't actually operating on John. What he was he was the head of the ER. And when John was brought in and they were trying to save him, they called up the head of the ER and said, there's a famous guy in our ER room. Do you want to come down and deal with the press and deal with the aftermath? And he was running down the road to get there, to get his 15 minutes. That's a bit unkind, actually. He was, you could say he's just running down there to do his job as head of the ER, but he certainly did get his 15 minutes afterwards, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And the problem with Stephen Lin lying, let's just be honest, he was lying about it. I think that's fairly clear now. All the doctors and nurses who did treat John have told me this. He's lying and has been lying for a long time. And there's even been a news documentary that was out, a CNN probably, about 10 years ago, where all the doctors and nurses all specify on camera that Lin's lying. And Lin's there still doubling down, saying, no, it was me. They've all got it wrong. I'm still telling the truth. But the problem is with Lin doing this is for 30 years, until Dr. Halloran, the real surgeon who came out and said, no, it was me who treated John, nobody got any details from Dr. Lin, because Dr. Lin couldn't give details about entrance and exit wounds. So for 30 years, the truth about where John was shot and how he was shot was kind of covered up by Lin's lies, because journalists they just took him at face value. Mm-hmm. They just said, yeah, okay, you're the guy who did it. But shamefully, they didn't ask him important questions like, where on John's body was he shot? And what happened to the bullets? Did they pass through? Did some bullets stay in him? Tell us the details. So they didn't do that. And if they did, he wouldn't be able to answer because he was in the background.
Right.
He did get to see, obviously, the wounds on the front, I think, pretty much. When they were turning John, I should just get into this. When John arrived, mm-hmm. they brought him in, and Dr. Halloran was the surgeon on call that night. He was there working that night in the ER. So he was rushed in and he started to work on John. They started to do IVs. There were 2 nurses. There was Nurse Barbara Camera and Nurse Deidre Sato, who were assisting Dr. Halloran. And there was also an anaesthetist called Eilish Egan, I think her name is, got a strange Irish name. And she was there as an anaesthetist and she was assisting as a nurse as well. So there was 3 women and Dr. Halloran. There was another doctor called Dr. Marks, who was out that night near the Dakota with his wife. He actually saw the aftermath of the shooting, and someone said John Lennon's been shot. And he ran to the hospital, left his wife on the sidewalk, ran to the hospital, and Richard Marks assisted Dr. Halloran. So they're the 2 doctors that are working on John with these 2 nurses and an anaesthetist. And Dr. Lin came later. But when Dr. Lin got there, he did actually see John being worked on the gurney. So he saw the wounds, which is important. He does have something, Dr. Lin, of importance to say, which we'll get to later. So they tried to save John. They realised that what they do is they strip all his clothes off. They flip him backwards and forwards. Okay, this is all routine stuff, they told me, mm-hmm. that they do. And they could see that he had 4 wounds, 4 in his upper left chest, entrance wounds, and 3 exit wounds out of his back, with 1 bullet that was nearest his upper left shoulder that stayed in. So it was kind of 3 bullets near the heart, all went through, straight through, no deviation. And they could tell this because the bullets that go in and the bullets that come out are slightly different. You know, when they go in, they're slightly smaller. When they come out, they're slightly bigger. But they could tell once they flipped him that these were the only wounds he had. Now, remember, they've stripped him naked at this point. They've taken off his jacket, they've taken off his jeans. They're expecting his body for any other wounds, which is what you've got to do. You've got to make sure he hasn't got any bullets in his legs or wherever. Mm-hmm. So they all got a very clear look at John here.
I mean, that's very, very critical distinction.
Yeah.
As in all murder cases, the difference between an entrance wound and an exit wound. And these doctors were emergency room doctors that saw gunshot wounds on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
There is a distinction between them.
Absolutely. So, and these are professionals, as you say. They've been in their job for quite a few years at this point. And they all have all told me unequivocally that John had 4 entrance wounds in his upper left chest, in a tight professional grouping, to call Dr. Halloran's description of it. And what happened after they failed to save John? Dr. Halloran cut a little incision in John's left chest on the side. And I said to him, this is to get in and pump his heart with his hands, which is something that he did.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him, did you disturb the wounds when you did that? Which is a very important question. And he said, no, the wounds were up here and I did an incision here. So there was no, when I tried to massage his heart, it didn't affect the four entrance wounds.
They didn't do a JFK tracheotomy.
Exactly. When they couldn't save him and they called it tragically, the two nurses, Deatra Sato and Barbara Camera, were instructed to go and wash John and shroud him. So Barbara started the procedure. Dee went off to deal with other issues, but she came back and helped Barbara. And what Barbara did was, after she washed and shrouded John, is she got another chance to see John's wounds without any blood at all, because she literally bathed him and sponged him down and wrapped him in linen, as you respectfully would do. And she's adamant. Barbara's probably got the best kind of opinion on all of it, because she saw him on the gurney when they're trying to save him, and she saw him in the room when they were wrapping him and washing him. And again, Barbara's adamant, 4 in the front, 3 out the back. And Dee came in and she saw it as well. So she's adamant. The problem is that another strange anomaly here is that the chief medical officer, a guy called Elliot Gross, who only had the job for about a year, came in that night, strangely, completely unexpectedly. This is something that chief medical officers have never done in these nurses' experience, and said, I'm the chief medical officer. My name's Elliot Gross. I want you to unwrap that man and I want to see his wounds. And they were like, well, why are you doing that? You're going to get to see his body the next morning. In a few hours' time, you have him for your autopsy. And are you who you say you are? Because what you're asking is so bizarre. We don't even believe you are who you are. He argued it out. He insisted. So they had to cut off his wrappings and they had to sit John up. They said it was, they were really furious at this point. They found all this very disrespectful. Elliot Gross walked around John's corpse, John's body, and just silently assessed the 4 in the front, 3 out the back. And then just walked out. So thank you very much, walked out. And they had to wash John again, because he was bleeding out again. They had to wash him again. So they got another chance to look at John's wounds, and they wrapped him again. So when Barbara and Dee say they know John Lennon's wounds, they know John Lennon's wounds. And they have no reason to lie about this. So the next sort of interesting stage in this information seeping out was when in 2011, Dr. Halloran decides to come out. So in 2011, a local news station contacts Dr. Halloran, and he comes out and says, yep, I'm the guy that tried to save John Lennon's life. Dr. Lynn's lying. And the reason I'm coming out now after 30 years to say is I just cannot stomach Dr. Lynn anymore going on documentaries and saying that he's the doctor who tried to save John Lennon's life. I'm sick and tired of it. He's lying. I'm the doctor that did this.
Was he aware of the misinformation that Dr. Lennon had been putting out all those years?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't really call it misinformation, because Dr. Lennon didn't give any information out, really, apart from the fact that he was the guy who pumped John's heart and tried to save him. He never talked about wounds and entrance and exit wounds, because Lynn couldn't really talk about that clearly, because he didn't really see them that closely.
Uh-huh. So that was why Halloran wasn't motivated any sooner at that point to say anything.
I said, why did you put up with this? And the thing about Dr. Halloran is he's one of these old school guys who just doesn't want any fuss. He wants a quiet life. He doesn't like media attention. And he found it all very uncomfortable coming out and calling out a colleague. But he literally had enough. And 5 years later, in 2016, some Hollywood producers decided to really get to the bottom of this. And they did a dramatic reconstruction of the Roosevelt Hospital called The Lennon Report as a film. And they got Dr. Halloran involved, and they got Barbara and Dee involved as consultants, which is great for them. And they thought, wow, fantastic. Finally, our truth is going to get out there. And, all this nonsense about Lynn and wounds and stuff will finally be known, and the world will finally get their head around it. Problem is, when they started to discuss with the producers and the writer about the entrance and exit wounds, the writer insisted that John was shot in the back. And they had this massive argument with the writer and said, look, we were there. We know he was shot in the front. Okay, you can't have 4 in the front, 3 out the back. With what we've seen in entrance and exit wounds, it's open and shut. He was shot in the front. And the writer said, well, that's not what Wikipedia said. Wikipedia says he was shot in the back. And Barbara came out with this fantastic line to the writer. She said, well, Wikipedia wasn't in the room that night when we were trying to save John Lennon. So you can just discard that. But they still lost the battle, because in the film, they still talk about being shot in the back. But they do talk about a man coming in with chest wounds. And it's interesting, actually. If you see any news features around the time, they often talk about John being rushed to hospital with chest wounds. So I think early on they knew they were chest wounds. And information they were getting from the cops and the people on the ground were chest wounds. But very slowly, well, after the autopsy, it morphed. Because the autopsy that Elliot Gross only revealed via a press conference, this autopsy is still being concealed under orders of the family, which is understandable. It's a very private medical document. But at the press conference, it was intimated by Elliot Gross that John was shot 2 times in the back and 2 times in the shoulder. And people just thought, okay, well, that's the official narrative. He was shot in the back. And Mark Chapman, to this very day, has said, I shot John in the back. So Mark thinks he's done something that he didn't actually do. We'll get into Mark a little bit later. Mm-hmm. But what we should say at this point about Elliot Gross is Elliot Gross on his record has had multiple, and I mean multiple, accusations of falsifying autopsies, sometimes on behalf of the NYPD. And the problem with this is there's so many accusations. Now, we must say for the record, he's never been convicted of this. He was never, even though he lost his job over this eventually, they said, look, we can't keep defending you, Elliot. You keep getting these accusations. You're going to have to go and he moved around. Mm-hmm. But he must have had very powerful friends, Elliot Gross, because he never seemed to kind of lose his license to be a medical officer. So every time he got accused of falsifying autopsies, he just moved on and carried on working. But this is the guy that did John Lennon's autopsy. This is the guy, it should have been Michael Baden. Michael Baden is a guy who was very much involved in the assassination hearings in the 70s with JFK, pretty much stand-up guy. Michael Baden was kicked out of his office at the start of 1980, completely out of the blue, by Mayor Ed Koch's office. And basically, Baden sued the mayor's office in New York and won for unfair dismissal. So they had no reason to dismiss him, but for some reason someone wanted to get Baden out of the way, and they wanted to get Gross in the way as 1980 came around. And sadly, Elliot Gross, this man with what I would consider personally a disgrace record, I think if you're accused multiple times of falsifying autopsies, I would consider that a disgrace record personally. Sadly, this was the guy who got to perform the autopsy on John Lennon.
Which we don't know what is in because it's been concealed, as you say.
We don't. I add some detail about what I've heard from people who've seen it in my book. There was a book called The Last Days of John Lennon, I think by James Patterson and a couple of other writers who said they got access to it and they discuss it. They didn't tell me what they found in the autopsy, but I heard from other people who've told me in confidence that they've seen it, and this is what it says. It basically says that John was shot kind of 2 times through the shoulder and neck, coming in from the side, and 2 times, one in the lower back and one in the upper back. Now, when I mentioned the lower back to the nurses and the shoulder, they swore. They were furious. They just said, that's just a crock of BS. They said, there's no way he was shot in the lower back. Mm-hmm. Because, it's something you would have noticed. It was very easy for them in a way because you had a tight grouping of 4 and you had a tight grouping of 3 out the back. So they could see it wasn't wayward. And I said to the nurses and to Dr. Halloran, I said, where do you think the shooter was? And they said, we're fairly certain we know where he was. He was, or she was. The shooter would have been sort of 2 to 3 feet at best, possibly 1 to 2 feet only away from John, very close up to him. And they would have walked up to him and shot him. And they had to be that close to achieve that tight professional grouping around his heart. He couldn't have been far away. It would have been impossible to keep that. And I said to Dr. Halloran, I said, you do realize that Mark Chapman was 20, 25 feet behind John over to the left and John was walking over to the right. And he said, well, that's impossible. He said, I don't think even a Navy SEAL could pull off that tight professional grouping from that distance in a darkened driveway. And it was a very darkened driveway with very low lighting, which it still has to this day, by the way. It still has very low orange glowing lights in that driveway. This is not a well-lit area. Mm-hmm. Using, by the way, a revolver that has a chamber. So this is not an automatic weapon. This is a weapon that you have to go around. There's a split second between each shot. Mm-hmm. So I told him where Chapman was, and he said, no, impossible. He said, even if John turned around, he said, there's no way anybody with a .38 revolver, even a Navy SEAL, was the quote he said, could pull that off from that distance in that location. So I said, you do realize that everyone says that this is where Chapman was and where John was? And he said, well, that can't be. He said, Chapman must have walked up to him and shot him 1 or 2 feet away. I said, well, that's not the case. So he's kind of confused and troubled by this. The nurses are equally very troubled by this. And they all just sort of think that the police and Chapman's lying and the police have got it wrong. And, all these documentaries and books have got it wrong. But we know where Chapman was. And we know where John was because we do have witnesses who placed Chapman just before the shooting and just after the shooting, standing by the sidewalk and gold booth side of the driveway, just inside by the iron black gate. And he had to be there to be seen by Richard Peterson, the taxi driver. And he had to be in that location to be seen by Guy Luthan, who saw him from the building across the road. Okay. Otherwise, if he was inside the driveway shooting John near the vestibule, no one would have been able to see much Chapman. He would have been out of view of Peterson. He'd been out of view of Guy Luthan, and he would have been not placed by Nina Rosen, a dog walker who came back on the scene just after gunfire and saw Chapman in that location. So we know where Chapman was. We also know that John was walking towards the vestibule when gunfire was heard. And we know that Richard Peterson, the taxi driver who was featured in the Apple TV series, saw Chapman standing there, saw John walk into the driveway, saw Yoko walk into the driveway, and he assumed that John must have been via the vestibule because there was a period of time between John walking past Chapman and Chapman getting a gun out and starting to fire. And he assumed that John must have been at least by the vestibule when he was allegedly getting shot by Mark Chapman's alleged bullets. But what's interesting to point out here, that Apple TV series is quite confusing. If you watch it, it will make you think via the edit that Richard Peterson saw Mark Chapman's bullets hit John Lennon. But he did not. He's told me that. He said, no, I couldn't see John. John was out of view. He just assumed that this gunfire must have been hitting John. But the way that Apple series is portrayed, it looks as if Peterson saw the whole thing. He did not. He pulled up. He saw Chapman. He might have saw Chapman pull a gun out and fire. Probably did on balance, but he might not have. But what Peterson doesn't tell people, and what he's not revealed, is that there's a couple of witnesses, one from across the road and one inside the Dakota, who actually, just after gunfire, saw a yellow taxi screech off at top speed away from the Dakota scene, which I believe was Richard Peterson. So I believe he saw gunfire. I believe he might have seen Chapman with a gun. I think he got scared and he drove off. I think he parked his car up, and I think he returned to the scene. And I think he picked up from Jose Perdomo, the doorman, and various witnesses that started to come on the scene what had happened. And I think he inserted himself into history more than he deserved. But it's very important that because, he's a very important witness now. And the Apple TV series portrays him as the witness because obviously Yoko doesn't talk about the murder. Let's talk just quickly before, I know I'm rattling on here, but let's talk about Yoko, because another thing people often say is, well, Yoko must have seen it. She's the witness. She hasn't said that Chapman didn't shoot her husband. But what people probably don't understand is Yoko hasn't said that she did see Chapman shoot her husband. She's never said that. She's had 43 years to say that. So why did she not say that? What's interesting about Yoko Ono is in the statements that she gave to Ron Hoffman, and I've got, as you know, I've got the detective's notebooks now and paperwork, which I feature in the book. She never actually says in the 5 statements that she gave to the NYPD that she saw Mark Chapman's bullets hit her husband. And rather worryingly, she talks often about different scenarios. She talks about a scenario where she's in front of John. She talks about a scenario where John's in front of her. She talks about a scenario where they cross paths in the driveway where there's not enough room to do that, really. This is not a long driveway, so I don't know how they had time to keep crossing paths. She talks about running in after John. She talks about not running in after John. She says John's been hit. Sometimes John doesn't say he's been hit. And of course, that could be PTSD. She was a lady in shock. It would have been a horrific thing for her to witness. But the one thing she does not say is, I saw Mark Chapman shoot my husband. And another thing she says, really importantly, is she says that when they were walking in, they heard a noise behind them, a kerfuffle in the street. And, I've got this written down in the notebook, word for word, but we did not turn around. Okay, so she's put that in there. So as they're walking in, they heard something. They didn't turn around. They kept walking because the official narrative wants us to believe that Mark Chapman called out to John and he turned around. And that must be how maybe these bullets got into his shoulder. The official narrative also wants to leave it a bit loose about maybe there's all this talk about the chest stuff. So maybe it was kind of when John turned around and Mark called out to him. So let's get down to the Mark calling out to John myth. Mark has never said in 43 years that he called out to John Lennon, ever. Okay, now, why wouldn't he say that? If he did it, it's a lot easier for Mark to say, I called out his name, he turned around and shot him in the chest. Mark's never said he did that.
Where did that come from?
Well, it came from a couple of places. It came from Detective James Sullivan, Chief Detective James Sullivan, mentioned it in his press conference that night. So you're thinking, well, why are you now already, this is very important to them. They wanted to lay this down quite early, but there was no evidence for it. Chapman certainly never said it in his statement to the police that night, which I've got and I put in my book, and I call it Mark Chapman Unplugged. It's a pure statement from a guy who just an hour ago thought he shot John Lennon. And he never says. And why wouldn't he? If he did, I called out to John, he turned around and shot him in the chest. It's no odds to Mark. He thought he shot John. So does it matter to him if he shot him in the front or back? So Sullivan laid down that legend. And recently, another person who's laid down that legend is our good old friend, Richard Peterson. Now, Richard Peterson, on the night of the murder, gave a statement, which I've got in Ron Hoffman's notebooks, and he doesn't mention Mark Chapman calling out to John Lennon. Okay, he just doesn't mention it. He mentions, seeing Mark, seeing a gun, hearing gunfire, but he doesn't mention Mark calling out. But now he mentions it. And now he says, yeah, I heard Mark call out. Now, remember, Peterson is in a parked taxi behind John's limo on a fairly street ambient. There would have been noise. Central Park wasn't far away. There wasn't many people around that time of night. It was Monday Night Football, very fortuitous for someone who wanted to plan a murder. But there would have been people around. There would have been city noise. New York is never quiet. He's also got 2 passengers in the back, okay? It's winter, so he's probably got his window up. Yet somehow, Peterson allegedly now hears Mark Chapman call out to John Lennon. So what I think's happened is Peterson has read this in later years, and he's repeating what he's read as something that he's heard. And Peterson does embellish. When I spoke to him, and I've got a recorded interview with Peterson, I said to him, is there anything else you haven't told me, Richard? I said, did Mark and John maybe interact? And he said, yeah, now you actually come to mention it. He said, yeah, I think they nodded at each other. And I just thought, well, you've just added that. You've just literally added that new bit of sauce. He also talks about bloody clothes being put in front of him at the police station, which could not have happened because I spoke to the nurses and they say the clothes were bagged up by them, ready to go with John's body to the morgue, which they said they saw it happen, that the clothes did go to the morgue with John's body. So how these clothes can then be transferred to John's bloody clothes to the police station, then put in front of Peterson, it's just nonsense. So Peterson is a guy who he's stretching his 15 minutes.
Sure.
He's stretching it hard. So Peterson has now said that's a problem. We've got someone who's embellishing. Sullivan said it without any evidence. Possibly the Dorman might have laid down that legend. We don't know, you see, because here's the thing. Jose Padermo, the infamous Dorman, who's not a Cuban assassin, by the way, and doesn't work for the CIA. And the reason I know this is I know he started working at Dakota in 1969. So how can a Cuban assassin start working at a building where John Lennon hadn't actually started living in to sort of plan the assassination for 11 years later? It's just nonsense. He's not that guy. They had the same name. They're both Cuban. They were both anti-Castro. That I can confirm. But one was a very serious CIA dude who was at the Bay of Pigs, and one was a Dorman at Dakota. Jose Padermo is a very common name. But Jose Padermo's statement, interestingly, to this very day, Robert, has never been released to the public. It's the only statement from a major player on the night that's never been released. And I can't for the life of me think why. And if I had to take a stab at it, I think the reason they've not released it is because it doesn't tell them what they want it to say. I think what Padermo did was, I think he opened the door for John and Yoko. I think they got out. I think Yoko did get out first. I think John then followed her. And I think he walked back to his booth. And I think he walked back to his gold booth, as was his way. And I think he heard gunfire. He came on the scene, and there was Chapman allegedly with a gun. We don't know. What we do know is, though, that Nina Rosen, a dog walker, who's only now just been revealed through Ron Hoffman's notebooks that I can reveal, she came back on the scene immediately after hearing gunfire. And what does she see? I'll tell you what she says she saw. She saw Padermo, and she saw Chapman by the sidewalk. So, okay, we know Chapman's now not near the vestibule, far down into the driveway. So that's very important. She saw no gun, which is troubling, because the gun had to get to the back of the driveway and be taken away by another guy. We'll get to that in a minute, the whole gun theatre. But she saw no gun. She saw no John, which is, again, odd, because he should have been shot in the driveway, but he's not there. And she saw Yoko in the courtyard, which is an area beyond the far driveway. It's a kind of gated area with a kind of a roundabout and a fountain. Yoko was in the courtyard screaming. Now, that's troubling because Yoko, as some of her statements says, she ran in immediately after John, not according to Nina Rosen. Nina's checked her in a place where she's not running after John. She's probably run away from the scene, and who can blame her?
Right. It's much more logical.
And, yeah, much more logical. And she heard Padermo say to Chapman, you need to get out of here because the cops will be here in a few minutes. Now, why would a big burly Cuban doorman / security man tell a guy who had allegedly just shot John Lennon and didn't have a gun on him? She didn't see a gun, Nina, to run away. You would think he would do a citizen's arrest, or he would call for backup, ask for some of his colleagues, shout into Jay Hastings, the concierge, come out and help me arrest this guy. But no, what Jose wanted Mark to do was he wanted Mark to run. And Mark has actually said, and the official narrative apparently has said, that he said this before Nina got on the scene. He told Mark to get out of here, just get out of here. So he was very keen, Jose, for Mark to run. And I believe that puts a big veil of suspicion over Jose Perdomo.
It doesn't make any sense that he would be so protective of a guy who apparently just murdered a guy that he'd befriended and been familiar with on a daily basis. That makes no sense whatsoever.
No sense. So let's talk about the gun, talking in no sense. Mark Chapman thinks that the gun, he either dropped the gun or Perdomo shook it out of his hand. Reports differ over the years. Mark is very variable on this point, as is the official narrative. So sometimes you hear that it was bravely shook out of Mark's hand by Perdomo. Sometimes Mark dropped it. But what's fairly consistent in the official narrative is that Jose Perdomo kicked the gun to the back of the driveway, which again is an important detail, because if Mark and the gun are at the sidewalk front of the driveway and the gun is kicked to the back of the driveway, yet again we have another piece of concrete evidence that Mark was nowhere near the vestibule after gunfire. He was out by the side. When Perdomo kicks it to the back of the driveway, the next thing we hear is another new character comes into the scene, is a basement crew, sometimes part-time doorman, a guy called Joseph Manny. Okay, often billed as the elevator operator. Okay, there was a kind of elevator. The opposite side of the vestibule, on the right-hand side, far end of the vestibule, on the other side of it was an alcove that led to a kind of water-powered lift, would you believe, that took you down to the basement, which is where the basement crew, all the cleaners and all the kind of janitors hung out and played cards. So Joe's down in the basement, okay, on the far opposite side, way down in the bowels of the Dakota building. And he's with two co-workers, Victor Cruz and Joe Grezik. So it's important for Joe that they're there because they've given statements and they corroborate what Joe has said happened. Joe said he heard 3 bullets, which is different to 4, different to 5, but we'll go with it. Joe heard 3. He said he heard gunfire, 3 shots fired. He came up in the lift with 2 co-workers who said he did this. So we know he did this because they've all corroborated in separate interviews. And he said when he came on the scene, he saw Mark Chapman standing by the sidewalk, reading a book, docile. He saw Perdomo at the far end of the driveway near the vestibule, walking around the gun in an agitated state. And Perdomo said to Joe Manny, take this gun downstairs, get rid of it. And Joe amazingly picked it up and did what he was told. Right? So he picks the gun up and goes down into the basement and puts the gun in a drawer. And we know he did this because Grezik and Cruz corroborate that he did this. Okay. Now, a couple of key questions here. Why did Perdomo not pick the gun up himself? Okay, so Chapman is now docile. He's reading his Capture in the Rye by the sidewalk. Perdomo's got the gun at the far end of the driveway, pacing around it. Why is he waiting for Joe Manny? How did he know Joe Manny was even going to arrive? Perdomo was a big guy, a bull-like figure. Why didn't he just pick it up and take it in himself into the concierge lobby area? Or why didn't he just put it in his own coat? Why was he so keen not to get his fingerprints on that gun? So let's get back to Joe. Joe comes back up, okay? Comes back up into the scene. He sees Chapman still standing there, docile, and he walks into the lobby area. And what he saw, Joe Manny, in that lobby area is another key component and another key crucial piece of evidence in understanding, I think, what happened to John Lennon when he was shot.
Getting back to the wounds and the testimony of Dr. Halloran and the nurses and what they are adamant about, the tight grouping of 4 entrance wounds above the heart. Well, we don't have the autopsy report, and the body was cremated within 36 hours. So we've lost that. What we do have is his clothing. Is that something we can access and determine once and for all how the wounds happened?
I hope so. I mean, amazingly, Yoko used the bag with the bloody clothes that John was wearing. Thankfully, the clothes were kept in the bag, but the brown bag, paper bag, where the clothes were contained in, she used that in an art exhibition, amazingly, about 10 years ago, I think, maybe more, maybe 15 years ago. So we know this bag exists. Well, we know it existed then. I hope Sean has access to this bag. And I hope when his mother passes, he will allow the world to see the contents of this bag. Because as you know, Sean Lennon very famously in 1998 came out and made a statement, which he was criticised for by Julian, that he thought the American government were behind the assassination of his father. So I think Sean is the kind of guy who might want to ask those kind of questions when his mother passes. I think Yoko has never wanted to talk about the murder, which is absolutely understandable. But I think when she goes, I think he might hopefully reveal the contents of that bag, because I think it'll be very interesting. Well, hopefully. We'll see. Who knows?
One of the things that you talk about in the book that is another one of these striking pieces of information that we didn't know about before, we were told that through a friend of his, Dana Reeves, who was a working policeman in Georgia at the time, Chapman got his hollow point bullets, which you couldn't just walk into a gun shop and buy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that you needed to be in law enforcement basically to access them legally.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were told that was what he loaded his weapon with, and that was what he used to kill John Lennon.
Mm.
But you came up with a photo that somebody took of two different types of bullets recovered. And you want to talk about that a bit? Because it doesn't make any sense again.
Yeah, sure. In Detective Ron Hoffman's paperwork, which I incredibly managed to access and get off him, there's a morgue receipt. And in that morgue receipt, it states quite clearly that there are two different types of bullets that were found in John Lennon's body. Now, remember, according to the doctors and nurses, there should only be one bullet in John. They saw 4 in the front, 3 out the back, 1 upper left chest, upper left shoulder area was stayed in. But according to Gross, one was found in John and one was found in his jacket. So that's kind of possible. Maybe one that passed out stayed in the jacket. So we'll give Gross the benefit of the doubt. But he said one was a semi-wad cutter hollow and one was just a normal lead bullet. Okay, it states quite clearly in the morgue receipt that there were two different types of bullets. One was hollow, one was not. A photographer called Brad Trent took some pictures back in the day of, amazingly, he was allowed to take a picture of the gun in a magazine article that he was doing on famous guns, I believe it was. And in this picture, this famous picture we can easily find online, there is one mushroom, because what happens with a hollow point bullet, it always mushrooms when it goes into a victim, and it comes out looking like a little mushroom shape. There's a hollow point there, and there's a non-hollow point, just a very straightforward, straight slug bullet, different caliber, different type of bullet. So Brad Trent's picture actually proves that as well. So we've got the morgue receipt and we've got the sort of visual evidence. I don't think we'll ever see these bullets again, by the way. There's been lots of, over the years, pictures of the gun. I think those bullets will be very conveniently disappeared. What's in the evidence vouchers, while we're on bullets, I've got all the evidence vouchers from the scene. The one thing that's not in the evidence vouchers is spent bullets. We've got the empty shells in the gun. We've got the gun, but we've got no spent bullets. So Mark had to, according to Mark, he shot 5 times. It had 5 bullets in it. It's called a fiver. It had 5 bullets in the chamber. Mark says 4 bullets hit John and 1 missed, but he's adamant, Mark, that he shot 5 times. Where's the rest of the bullets? And why have we not seen the rest of the bullets? Where's the evidence voucher for the bullets? It certainly wasn't in Ron Hoffman's paperwork. And when I asked Ron about this, he was very vague about it, couldn't remember. What I have discovered is that, incredibly, Commissioner Ray Kelly, an NYPD commissioner who's a very famous law enforcement guy in New York, he actually was asked by Officer Cullen, who was one of the officers first on the scene at the Dakota, what he was doing at the station that night when he just suddenly popped up, because he was an emergency captain in a different precinct, working in a different area on the emergency side. But he had previously worked at the 20th, so this Officer Cullen knew him. And he said, "What are you doing here, Ray?" He said, "I'm here to collect spent bullets. It's just a formality." And the question is, why bring in Captain Ray Kelly from the emergency unit to collect bullets on the ground when there was a raft of detectives and cops at the 20th precinct who could quite easily have done the same job? So it's very interesting that Ray Kelly was drafted in to do that. And it's even more interesting that Ray Kelly in his autobiography has decided not to ever mention his little job that he had to do at the Dakota that night. So I hope someday a journalist will knock on Ray Kelly's door and ask to see if he can remember turning up at the Dakota that night to pick up spent bullets as a formality. And I'd like to find out how many spent bullets he found and what kind of bullets they were. But I've got a feeling, Robert, we're never going to get that answer.
Right. And then there was the hunk of metal found at the crematorium.
Yeah.
In the ashes.
Yeah, another absolutely bizarre story. Yoko and John had a ex-FBI agent as a bodyguard. That's another topic for another podcast.
McDougal, yeah. Do you want to say at least a little bit about that?
Yeah, Doug McDougal, hired by Yoko. Allegedly, some people told me who knew them that, she did it to get info out of him about what the FBI had on John. I don't understand why, after all those years of harassment by the FBI, that Yoko would do that. But she did hire Doug. He's a guy with an interesting past, interesting colleagues that he's worked with. But Doug was the guy that Yoko asked to take John's body from the morgue to Ferncliff Crematorium to get him cremated, something John never wanted to do, allegedly, but that's what Yoko wanted to do. And they did it, I believe, quite hastily, as you say, 36 hours after his death. He did that. He duly did that. He took John to the crematorium and John was cremated. And in the box, in the urn or box of ash, and that was an urn. And I've got the document. I think I put it in the book, didn't I? The letter that Doug McDougal sent to Hoffman saying that we found a small metal object that shouldn't be there. What do you want us to do, Ron? And Ron said that, they sent it off for testing and it came back and they believed it was a bit of the metal basket that was placed into the oven that chipped off and fell into John's ashes. I mean, it's just nonsense. Doesn't make any sense that a piece of metal will chip off. So we still don't really know. It's probably a bullet. I suspect Gross didn't do his job properly. I suspect they didn't care how many bullets were in John, to be honest with you, or where they were placed in John. I think Gross, you could build a case that Gross went to the hospital that night, saw the real wounds. The next morning, he conducted an autopsy that probably inadvertently, perhaps, or possibly purposefully fitted the official narrative that Mark shot him in the back. And these bullets, were just kind of inconvenient, really, what kind of bullets were in John. I'm pretty certain that would have been a bullet. Bullets can survive a cremation, so it's more than likely it was a bullet. I don't think we'll ever find out, to be honest with you. I think the bullets from the spent bullets from the scene that Ray Kelly was there to collect, and I think the bullets that possibly were in John's ashes will never be seen or heard of again. They've certainly never been seen since the night. And they love showing you the gun. Mm-hmm. They love that. Oh, look, here's his gun. I think there's even an unverified picture of the shells, the empty shells, but there's no images of the bullet, apart from Brad Trent, who kind of inadvertently, took pictures of those bullets. He was there to take a photo of the gun. The bullets were there the two bullets, the non-hollow and the hollow, were there in a little envelope. I don't think Brad was really meant to take them out of the envelope and take a picture of them, but thank goodness he did, because it proves that John has two different types of bullets in his body.
Right. There doesn't seem to be a consensus on where he ended up and where he was found.
Mm.
And it seems to be a very bizarre aspect of the whole story for somebody supposedly shot in the driveway that was then found face down in a back office inside the Dakota. Mm. That's a journey that involves going through a door, going up some steps, going through another office, the concierge desk, to end up where supposedly he was found face down on a rug, on a tiled floor where blood collected. We still don't know that, and is that something you could speak to a bit of how unsettled? It's like nobody can agree on that story.
Yeah, well, the one thing all the medical people can agree on, strangely, including Elliot Gross and Lynn, and the doctors and nurses, they all agree on one thing for sure. John would have died almost instantly from his wounds. They've all pretty much said that. Dr. Lynn said that death would have happened instantly. I think Gross has been quoted as saying almost immediately afterwards or something like that. The doctors and nurses, who are the ones who I really put biggest faith in, they say absolutely 100% they're convinced that the second he had those 4 big holes placed into his upper left chest around his heart, all his kind of arteries around his heart were blown away. His left subclavian artery was completely severed, which means all use of his left arm and down his left side would have been gone instantly. They find it laughable. I hate to use that word, but they find it almost comical that there is a story now, because they're beginning to see through this Apple series. They're hearing people like Jay Hastings talk about John running past him, and they're furious and confused, and they can't understand how people are credibly saying that John moved after he was shot. So here's the problem, you see. For Mark Chapman to shoot John, front or back, take your pick, in the driveway, He has to make this incredible journey that all of the medical people who saw his wounds are all adamant he could never make. So they all assumed at the time, and only recently through my book and my discussions with them, and they now know that John went on this incredible journey we're about to discuss, they just assumed he died in the driveway where Chapman shot him. They assumed Chapman walked right up to him, shot him very close in the front, and John collapsed in the driveway, and that's where the cops found him. But the cops did not find John there. And remember, Nina Rosen didn't see John there. So we got someone who came on the scene very quickly and said, no, John Lennon. Immediately after gunfire, he wasn't there. John allegedly got shot 4 times. His subclavian artery was completely blown away. Breathing would have been almost impossible. But here's what they want us to believe he then did. And they have to make us believe this because, as you say, his body was found. There's many, many witnesses who tell us where John's body was found. They say John walked up to a glass paneled vestibule door, which is quite a light door. It was a light structure. So let's be kind. It wasn't a heavy door, but it was a door you had to pull open. So he pulled open this door. He walks into a small porch area, which is a little bit like a London telephone booth, quite small, not a big area. And this was at the bottom of the stairs. It was a kind of temporary construction that was put up in wintertime to stop wind blowing up into the Dakota lobby. He's in this little porch area. He then approaches some steps. This is with all these wounds. He then walks up 5 steps, quite steep steps. I've seen a recent picture, which I'm about to post soon, that shows just how steep these steps were. These were not gently sloping steps. These were steep steps. He walks up these 5 steps. He's now confronted by mahogany doors, 2 mahogany doors, which are very thick. He opens these mahogany doors, but let's be kind and say they were open. I don't think they were. It was winter. I think for security and fire reasons, they would have been shut, but let's just say they're open. He goes through these mahogany doors. He's now in the lobby area, okay, which is an area over to the right-hand side where you can get buzzed into your apartments. And on the left-hand side is a long marble desk, okay, which is where the concierge talks to people and gives them his parcels and mail and greets them. On the extreme left, as John walks in, very extreme left, is a little swinging door, like a saloon door, which allows someone to walk into the concierge's front office, which is behind that desk, okay? That's the concierge's front office. And the person that was there that night was a concierge called Jay Hastings. Very interesting man. Now, John walks through that swinging door. He's now into the front office, okay? He walks, staggers, run. Sometimes Jay says run, sometimes staggered. Let's say staggered. Past Jay. He's still on the move, John, by the way. He staggers past Jay and says, I've been shot. Twice now. Jay is saying he said it twice. And he goes on beyond that front office into a back office, the superintendent's back office. Don't know whether the door was open or not. I'm assuming it was open. And he gets into the back office and then he collapses face down on a rug, which is where all the cops who found him, Peter Cullen, Herb Fraunberger, Tony Palmer, they all said John was face down like that, like a child who's just been splattered out. And that's where they found his body. So when I say this journey that John allegedly did to the medical people, to the doctors and nurses, they just say impossible. No, he could not have done that journey with those injuries. He had to have been moved. When I discussed with the lead detective, Ron Hoffman, where he thought John was shot in the driveway, he said, no, he wasn't shot in the driveway. He was shot on the stairway in the vestibule. And if you actually look at a video that's on my YouTube channel, Assassination of Lennon, there's a video taken at the hospital that night, just after John was pronounced dead. Hoffman is besieged by journalists. It's a really interesting thing because it's totally unrehearsed. He's unprepared. He's very hostile, Hoffman. And 2 things are said. One is, we heard there was a second shooter. Hoffman doesn't answer that. But isn't it interesting that journalists very early on were hearing rumors of a second shooter? And then they say, where was he shot? And Hoffman says he was shot inside the vestibule, as he was walking inside the vestibule. So Hoffman, not only has he told me this on tape, that John was shot on the stairway in the vestibule, but he actually said it on the night to journalists that he was shot inside the vestibule. And if you actually look at crime scene photos, you can see the cordon is all around, the sort of police stop signs and cordon is all around those vestibule doors. They're not in the whole driveway. So they knew that's where John was shot. I mean, we won't even get into the low down bullet holes. I mean, God knows how they got there. Whether you go with my sort of theories or you go the official narrative, those bullet holes just shouldn't be there. And there's another bullet hole in the far vestibule door that Chapman couldn't even see. How that bullet hole got there, again, it's impossible to square. So if John was shot inside the vestibule and Mark is standing out in the sidewalk and John was shot in the front in a kind of tight professional grouping, you kind of have to start thinking to yourself, and this is where it sort of came to me like this kind of horrible, creeping feeling as I was investigating it, because I never, ever dreamed I would come up with a scenario where the only thing that actually made sense is that a second shooter had shot John on the stairway in the vestibule area and surprised him. I just couldn't believe that that was the only credible theory. And I still believe that's the only credible theory for how John was shot with those wounds in that location that the police knew he was shot at. But here's where things get really creepy. How then did John get from being shot and assassinated inside the vestibule on the stairway area? How did he get from there, with wounds we know that would have killed him almost instantly, into the back office? Okay, so that's troubling. That's a journey we know he couldn't make. So I spoke to Joe Manny about this, and Joe Manny is the kind of key to understanding a lot of this. And I said to Joe, when you came back up after hiding the gun, what did you see? And Joe's very adamant about this. He said, well, I saw three very important things. I saw in the front office, not the back office, I saw in the front office behind the desk in a marble indentation, he gave a lot of detail, a big pool of blood. And I thought, okay, that's kind of weird. That shouldn't be there. And I saw John and Yoko in the back office. And I saw Jay covered in blood, his shirt covered in blood. And he also said full of blood. 2 words, covered and full. So clearly Jay's shirt was very bloody. And Jay has admitted this to me, that his shirt was very bloody on the night. He's not denying that. So I said...
Did he explain how it got there?
Well, here's the thing. So I said to Joe, I said, so how did that blood get in the front office, Joe? And he said, well, I just assumed, he said, that Jay and Yoko laid John down in the front office, panicked that Mark Chapman might come and shoot him again, and dragged his body into the back office, which is where Joe and another Dakota resident has confirmed it was. It was in the back office, as well as the cops, of course. And I said, okay, that's interesting. Now, Jay Hastings denies that there was blood in the front office, okay? He says, no, Joe's lying. There's no blood in the front office. So that's interesting that they both... I can't understand why Joe would lie about that. But anyway. So I said, how did you think Jay's shirt got covered in blood, Joe? He said, well, he told me on the night. I said, oh, yeah, what did he say? He said John fell into his arms. Because he fell into his arms, his shirt, John was all bloody on his chest, got covered in blood. So I said to Jay, did John fall into your arms, Jay? And he said, no, he just ran past me. Something we know he couldn't do, by the way. Right. Well, with the medical evidence. So he ran past me. No, he didn't fall into my arms. So he's denying that. So I kind of, at this point, I said, I've spoken to Jay many times, interviewed him many times. And I said to Jay, in one of my sort of later interviews with him where I was starting to get troubled about the anomalies, I said, look, Jay, you need to tell me how this blood got on your shirt, because it's kind of looking a bit weird for you here. It's not good. You're saying he ran past you, the medical saying that couldn't happen. Joe is saying that you said he fell into your arms, you're now saying that didn't happen. You know, what's the deal here, Jay? And Jay said, the reason I got John's blood all over my shirt is the cops asked me to carry John's body out from the Dakota. They asked me to help carry him out. And I was given, as he called it, rather callously, the bloody business end, which was John's head and upper shoulder and arms. And he said another cop took the legs. And he said, we carried him out and we put him in the police car. Now, the big problem with that for Jay is I've spoken to the 2 cops who actually did carry John's body out, Herb Frauenberger and Tony Palmer, separately. And they both said, no. Well, the concierge didn't help us. We did it ourselves. Joe Manny said cops carried John out and he saw them do it. Witnesses on the street that were beginning to sort of mingle around the front of the Dakota said they saw 2 cops carry John's body out. And even Mark Chapman, would you believe, who at this point was handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, has gone on, and you can see this video on YouTube, has gone on camera and said in the 90s that 2 cops carried John's body out, and the cop that was carrying John's head and shoulders, Tony Palmer, swore at me. And I was really scared because he was really angry at me. I spoke to Tony Palmer and he said, yeah, that was me. I swore at Chapman. So we've even got Chapman corroborating. So we've now got to ask ourselves, why is Jay Hastings lying about carrying John's body out? Because we know he didn't do that. There's multiple witnesses, including Chapman, that say he didn't do that. But he wants the world to believe that's how he got his shirt covered in blood. And one last little disturbing anomaly is he sold a shirt about 10 years ago now for a substantial amount of money with a signed album. His alleged bloody shirt for the night he was working at the Dakota when John was assassinated. And what's interesting about that shirt, Robert, is there's no blood on it. It's just got a few sweat stains under the arms. It's completely spotless.
So he laundered it and kept wearing it?
Yeah, he must have an amazing laundry. I mean, I don't know what washing powder was like in 1980 or beyond, but bloodstains are quite hard to get out. So I don't think that's the shirt. So, yeah, Jay Hastings' bloody shirt, John's magical mystery tour from the stairway, excuse the awful pun, to the back office is all deeply, deeply disturbing. And none of it adds up. And it needs to be investigated again, the whole murder for me, Robert. It's kind of, the official narrative is bunk now. I think, the medical, the forensics, the witness statements on the ground, none of it adds up. And I can understand, Robert, why people are troubled by it, because it is deeply troubling. I'm not a guy who believes in I don't believe the earth is flat. I don't go for most conspiracy theories, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot wrong in all the assassinations. I just find it bizarre how people can say, oh, I don't believe in conspiracy theories, when clearly things like the JFK assassination have now been kind of, officially government stamped as probably being a conspiracy. And don't get us into Iraq and Afghanistan and all the rest of it, So, we know we get lied to by governments. And it's just because John was such a beloved figure and such a wonderful man in so many ways, I can see why people just don't want to go there and are really angry. I remember one of the early kind of responses I got was, this is so disrespectful to John that you're even questioning this. And I'm like, well, actually, what's disrespectful is not understanding properly how he died and the anomalies that surround his death. That's what's disrespectful.
Yeah.
And John, I'm sure, I can't speak for John, but I'm certain he would have said, ask questions about things. Don't be frightened to ask questions. Don't believe everything you're told. And he was a seeker, John, wasn't he? He was a very curious guy.
That's totally on brand.
Totally on brand.
Yeah.
And I think it's amazing that John Lennon fans, Beatles fans, feel they're somehow honoring him by burying any questions around his death. It's just, I get it. It's really upsetting. It's dark. I've got to be honest with you, Robert, I've not enjoyed this journey. It has been a dark, horrible 3 years for me.
Sure.
More than 3 years now, 3.5 years. It's not been an enjoyable process. I don't like uncovering this stuff. But sometimes I think about, how the hell did I do that? Why did I do that? But once I started doing it, I felt some strange obligation to keep going, And it's not my job to fit the puzzle all together. I think I've done a pretty good job of it, to be honest. I think I have.
Right.
Yeah, I think I have. But
to your credit, yes. You don't lay out a scenario that, well, this is how it happened.
Exactly.
You're asking the questions. To sweep it under the rug is to misread everything John Lennon ever stood for.
I agree.
It was totally about questioning, as you say, and the way to honor him is to put him at peace with what really happened to him, is how I read it. Yes, it is extremely uncomfortable. As you say, once you go down this trail, it is disturbing. It is very unsettling. This is the most joyless show I've probably ever done. And
sorry.
Yeah, no, it's not a reflection on you at all. It's, you can't unlearn something when something's been revealed to you. If we honor and revere John Lennon at all, it is up to us. I don't know what we do with this now, but you've set us in a direction with your research. The anomalies are there. You can daydream and keep your eyes closed. Living is easy, but maybe it shouldn't be.
I agree. I think what's also very difficult with this case, Robert, is, of course, the man who's accused of doing it believes he did it. So with Oswald, he was there in the Dallas police station saying, I'm a patsy, Siran, day one, I don't remember what happened.
Right.
With Chapman, if you look at what he said on the night of the murder, right, which is the most important statement, because some of the nefarious people that got into his cell, it's almost unbelievable. It's almost comical how nefarious some of these people were who got into his cell. And I don't know if we've got time to cover that now, but we can perhaps touch on that a little bit. But if you look at that statement that he gave at the 20th precinct, just a couple of hours after the murder, I think it was done round about maybe less than that, an hour and a half after the murder, He says, I had nothing against John Lennon. I had nothing against the Beatles. I don't know why I did it. It was like a compulsion. There was a small part of me and a large part of me, and the small part of me lost, and the large part of me. And I was kind of, if you look at what he said before the murder, it was a runaway train. It was like a compulsion. He's a confused guy. This is not a guy who, as we've been told to believe now, is like, I killed him to want to be famous. And this is not a guy who's trying to get out of it by saying, I didn't do it. Someone else did.
Right.
This is a guy who said, I think I did it, but I don't know why I did.
The narrative kept changing, as you point out in the book.
Absolutely.
First it's Catcher in the Rye, then it's not Catcher in the Rye. Then it's I want to be famous, then I'm not acting like somebody wants to be famous. There's a hit list. Oh, well, maybe he didn't write that hit list. All these things we were told, which come to find out under closer examination, completely fall apart.
Yeah, they do.
And if we just want to touch on one thing, I think it should probably be a separate conversation to go into not only Chapman, but Klein, Milton Klein, Bernard Diamond,
Good idea.
Steven Spiro, all these other characters.
That's a part two, for sure.
The people that entered his life, and you do the backstory on them, it takes you in a direction where it starts to come into focus what this may have been.
Yeah.
But to touch on just one thing, his hotel room, which we were told he had a display set up, a shrine, this stuff, this further incriminating things. But one of the things that was found that didn't somehow make it into public knowledge, the 120 pills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, you could speak to that, and in fact, you do in the book a bit about how this fits into things, possibly, if you're looking for, well, if Chapman didn't do it, who did it, and what was Chapman doing there with a smoking gun?
Yeah, I mean, they made it, as I'm sure you know, Robert, and I'm sure all Beatles fans know, if they try to recall the horrible details of the murder and how it was sold afterwards, was, oh, Chapman, such a creepy, strange guy who did it for fame. And he wanted the world to know who he was by putting a display out in his hotel room to tell everybody who he was. So, don't get me wrong, I'm going to be infamous, and I want you to know the details of me to make sure that you don't put me in the wrong bracket here. And there was a Todd Rundgren tape. There were some pictures of him working with Vietnamese children. There was a Wizard of Oz picture. It was all very strange stuff. There was an airline ticket, all kind of fluff, really. But every documentary, they bring it out as like, oh, yeah, his strange hotel display. He wanted the world to kind of understand him through this display. That display was there. I've got the evidence voucher. Okay, all those things were there. We don't know the details of the plane tickets. I'd like to get a good look at those, the dates of when he flew out and stuff. That's a topic for another conversation another day. But, that display was there for sure. And even Chapman has said, yeah, it was a bit weird, that display, wasn't it? It was kind of looked a bit like a suicide kind of note in kind of item form. But what the NYPD and the DA's office didn't tell people, and what I discovered shockingly in Ron Hoffman's paperwork and notebooks, is there was an evidence voucher for 3 different types of pills, 2 white types of pills and 1 red type of pills that were unidentified. They assumed they were vitamins or assumed they were paracetamol or whatever. But what they did was they sent them off. There were 3 different types. There were 120, I think it was 120 in total. 2 different types of white pills and 1 type of red pills, unidentified, but they assumed they were vitamins. But if they were vitamins, surely they would be in a vitamins bottle. So, and quite why Mark Chapman was taking for his assassination hitman day out in New York, why you'd bring along 3 different types of vitamins, why he was concerned about his health at that point is a very interesting point. But the really interesting point here, Robert, is those 3 different types of pills, they didn't know what they were because they sent them off and got it on the voucher. They sent them off to a lab to be verified. So they were unidentified. Why would you send it off to a lab to be verified if you knew exactly what they were? We don't know what that verification came back was. That was, again, like this metal object that was found in John's ashes. It went off into a lab to be verified, never to come back again. As far as I could see in the paperwork anyway, there's certainly nothing there to say what they were. He also strangely had a bottle of Vaseline with him as well in this pill collection that was vouchered as evidence in his hotel room. But what I'd like to understand here is, Robert, and what I think people need to consider is, why was that covered up? If they were just vitamin pills, why didn't they just say there were some pills, we had them checked out, they were vitamin pills? No problem. Game over. Nothing to it. But it was concealed. It was hidden. And the question then I have to ask myself is, if you would consider unverified pills, if you would consider burying those unverified pills, what else have you buried that we don't know about? And I think this is why I'm probably never going to hear from Kim Hogreff, the prosecuting DA, ever again, or possibly any NYPD official spokesman on this. Because what's interesting is the silence. For the last 8 months, I've come out and I brought this stuff out into the public conscience now, and certainly my book lays it all out. But the silence is deafening. And I think the silence is deafening is because I can prove that they've concealed stuff. And I can prove that they concealed stuff that people should know. If Mark Chapman had unidentified pills on him in his hotel room, we need to know about that. And what were those red pills? As I'm sure you know, Robert, thorazine, which is a mind control drug that the CIA used, was very famously a red pill. Were these pills used to keep Mark in a particular docile state of mind, to make him pliable to be susceptible to a command hallucination, to make him think at the Dakota driveway that he was doing something he shouldn't, or he wasn't actually doing? At the end of the day, you can't get away from the uncomfortable facts, Robert, that Mark Chapman, to this very day, thinks he did something he didn't do. So you have to work out, there's nothing in it for Mark to lie about what he thought he did. Shot John front, back, legs, arm, where it doesn't matter. You know, he said, I thought I shot him. So the key question is, who was messing with Mark's mind? And I discovered, as you say, we're going to save it for another part, a lot of very, very nefarious characters were messing with Mark Chapman's mind before the murder and, importantly, after the murder. And I know people get very uncomfortable with hypnotism. I'm uncomfortable with it. But we know from people like Darren Brown that people can be hypnotized to do a destructive act. You know, Darren Brown, a famous UK hypnotist, got an audience member hypnotized to think he was shooting Stephen Fry on a stage. You know, you can find this video. It's very easily accessible. And the guy picked up a gun with blanks and attempted to shoot Stephen Fry on a command hallucination. So this can be done. And, you know, we know the CIA were doing Manchurian candidate work through MKUltra. This has all been documented. It's all been released. This is not a conspiracy theory. Documentation is out there. The CIA have admitted it. We know Navy intelligence was doing the same thing. It's all been admitted. And the last thing I think we should sort of finish on here before we get to part two, which I'd love to do, by the way, is the man who was actually in charge of the CIA's Manchurian candidate create a murder under hypnotism program for the CIA was a man called Milton Klein. And incredibly, Milton Klein was one of the first hypnotists/psychiatrists who was sent into Mark Chapman's cell, literally days after the murder. Closed the door and had him all to himself. Now, if you think that's just a coincidence, that's fine. That's fine. Maybe it is just a coincidence. But for me, for that guy who had that particular purpose in his life to just walk into Mark Chapman's cell and have him all to himself, well, I find that deeply, deeply disturbing.
I would say that most government agencies concerned with intelligence operations have been looking to hypnosis as a tool for a variety of purposes, one of which is to carry out and to execute certain intelligence operations on a basis where they would not have to rely completely on some of their own emotional reactions. Actually,
would that entail murder?
It could, if you consider that an act of killing someone under circumstances of war is murder. I think one has to define what that means.
Under circumstances of peace.
Under circumstances of peace, it would be murder.
You have to go where the evidence takes you, and you've done a great job of that. And I know how disturbing this is for people. People get very emotional, as you say. It's very easy to find commentary on this project, on the JFK assassination, on anything else you want, where certain people are open-minded. They may not claim to have a full understanding of what went down, but they know it's not right. There is anomalies here, and how you interpret them is up to the individual. And then there's the other side, people, case closed, this is what happened, and they're very, very vehement and angry about it. So I guess it is this sort of litmus test for people's psychological makeup of how receptive they are to processing new data and how they want to stick with the comfort of what they've been told.
Comfortably numb's nice, Robert.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of a nice place to be. I was comfortably numb for many years, you know, until that JFK film came along. It jolted me, and I was comfortably numb after that film, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Life's hard enough without all this dark stuff coming into view. And I don't blame people. I don't like the personal attacks. I don't like the name calling. If you want to say my work's rubbish and you don't believe it, that's great. I respect. That's fine. fine.
But at least take in the work. Read the book, listen to an interview with you. Then if you want to weigh in, then if you want to criticize, go at it. But if you are going to knee-jerk, reactionary, engage in ad hominem attacks or dismiss it out of hand, don't bother me with your valueless opinions. Know what you're talking about first, and then we can have a conversation.
Yeah, I agree. You probably think I'm being too kind to my detractors, but it was a very well sold murder. It's been so consistently well sold. Every documentary and article and book has been pretty much on the same page. They've moved things around a little bit, shoulder back.
Yeah.
He turned, he didn't turn, but it's been very, very well packaged.
Right. There wasn't a proper investigation because they thought they'd solved it within minutes of it happening.
Absolutely.
As you point out, police departments are overtaxed, underfunded, stressed out. If they can close the door on one right away, they're going to do it. It needn't be anything nefarious as a active, proactive cover-up. It could just be, let's get this off our ledger and move on.
Yeah, Detective Hoffman said to me, I'm very fond of Ron Hoffman. I think he did a dreadful job. In fact, I don't think he did a job at all. But I am fond of him. He's kind of quite loyal to his men, and he's a nice guy. And history owes him a debt for him allowing me to have all his notebooks and paperwork. But he knows he didn't do a good job. He's kind of almost said, I guess I didn't do a good job, did I? When I bring up the medical stuff, and I think he allowed me to have access to his paperwork because deep down he knows that. And I think he knows there's more to it. Even when he said to me that John was shot on the stairway in the vestibule, I didn't pull him up on that because I just thought he's a guy in his 80s. He's not been well. He's not the problem. It's a bigger problem than the lead detective's not doing a great job. I think that the media also have to look at themselves here. To be fair to the Mail Online, when I approached them in April, they really put me through the ringer. I had to show them all my evidence. I had to show them all the paperwork, all the notebooks. I had to show them everything. And it took a while for me to convince them because they were because like everyone else, they bought it for 43 years, but they went, there's something here. And they ran 2 stories. I'm forever in their debt for doing that. That wasn't easy for them to do that.
Right.
There's a lot of vitriol and bad comments when those stories came out. But I think the rest of the media, we'll see. I've approached lots of mainstream media now. I've got the book now. And I said, there's certain public broadcasters we've got here in the UK. And I've been quite direct with them. I said, look, it's in the public interest. You're a public broadcaster. Stuff I've uncovered here with evidence has to be told to the public. You can do it in any form you like, but you can't bury this anymore. Get it out there, let people make their own minds up. And if someone can come up with a coherent sort of story of how those wounds got confused, and if someone can come up with a coherent story of how a man with those kind of wounds could go on that journey, and they can explain to me how all the different statements with Jay and Joe and the Dorman and all the rest of it all match up when we know they don't, fine, put it all together. That's great. And explain to me all these anomalies and we can all move forward. I'd love to draw a line under it. Go, great. It's all been explained now. But they won't be able to do that. I know that for a fact. I've lived in that driveway, Robert, for 3 years. Not only is it dark in real life, it's kind of dark in your imagination, this kind of story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just talking to the people involved, I've not found that an easy process either. But, it's there now, it's done. I'm proud of the book. I've put everything in the book. I've not held anything back. There's a couple of statements that contradict what I think happened, and I've just put them in there. Because if there's a statement, I'll put it in there, and as you know, at the end of the book, I put a summary. I point out what I think is of interest. I put a summary at the end of every chapter because it's that kind of confusing story that I want to keep reminding people what to remember.
That was very useful. I'm really glad you did that.
Oh, good.
And I've read everything,
you, yeah.
and it was useful for me because this is not an easy read. It's not an easy thing to grasp onto, whereas the official narrative is very easy, and therefore people are going to embrace that because it's comfortable. As you said at the beginning of the conversation, going into your background in news and media, it's almost like the stories are scripted before they send the reporter out to do a story on them. And there's no reason to expect not more of the same with this, even with your book out there. But it would be nice if, having laid out all the breadcrumbs, somebody of a Woodward Bernstein bent might want to take it forward, go where you couldn't go deeper. That would be what I would hope for this. Or say you're a crackpot and come up with an explanation that explains everything. Bullet wounds from the front when Chapman was in the back, and all these slugs that don't match, that can't be accounted for. all the stuff. You've shined a great light on all these anomalies that just can't be dismissed or explained away.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And I feel I've done all I can do. I've done my job, and I sleep very well at night. Now it's done. I sleep better now it's done. It's out there, and you're right. I really hope some big hitters pick it up. Some did in April. Some of the press followed the Mail Online story in different countries around the world. And I am getting a lot of mainstream interest now, which is great. And I think there will be some mainstream stuff, more documentaries coming.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there'll be a new investigation. I really don't. But if Sean wants to reveal things in the future, that will be great. I haven't directly approached Sean and Julian. It would be wrong to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I'd love their support if they want to get involved further down the line. I suspect that might happen once Yoko dies. But we'll see. It's not my job to go chasing family members and stuff. It's just my job to investigate, lay out all the evidence that I found. And as I say in the book, it's up to you now. You decide what you think happened. But pretty much everyone has come back to me and said, yeah, it's not the way it was. We've been told it was. That's for sure. That much we know. Now we've read your book. And let's see what happens, Robert. Let's see. There's more to come, I think. There is more to come. I think I've got all the witnesses now, and most of them are dead now, sadly, as well. But some people have broke cover.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put it that way. Some key people have broke cover, and they're starting to talk since my book's come out. And I look at those interviews with great interest, because I think there's, as my book reveals, after the murder, sometimes you can tell the most from a cleanup operation and from what people do after the assassination. And their actions and motives around Mark and around the people that knew him can be very revealing and very telling. And I think that's also going to be the case now going forward after my books come out. I think some people, not only what they're saying, but what they're now pointedly not saying, how they're trying to change their biography and omit certain things that are troublesome. So, there's more to come. And all I can say is, Robert, thank you. I really do appreciate you doing this. I know it can't have been easy for you, my friend. You are one of the best Beatles podcasts out there, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot of flack for this. So it's a very brave thing you've done here, and I really admire you for doing it.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the work you put in. I am looking forward to a Mind Games Revisited. Hopefully it won't take 30 years, but I think as the stuff, as you are saying right now, people are starting to loosen up. Maybe that can be something, further pieces added to the puzzle that you've collected and amassed here. So thank you for that. Thank you for the work, and we'll see what happens, but you can't unlearn something once it's been put in front of you. Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis.
I'd hate to be in your shoes today. You have a lot to think about. You've seen much hidden evidence the American public has never seen. Going back to when we were children, I think that most of us in this courtroom thought that justice came into being automatically, that virtue was its own reward, that good would triumph over evil. But as we get older, we know this just isn't true. Individual human beings have to create justice, and this is not easy, because the truth often poses a threat to power, and one often has to fight power at great risk to themselves.
Gandhi and Martin Luther King are great examples of fantastic non-violence who died violently. I can't never work that out. We're pacifists, but what does it mean when you're such a pacifist that you get shot? I can never understand that.